Can actually build our own currency systems which work to improve the relationships between people within communities, where the people work and share a lot of the economic benefits from the wealth they're creating. And they're constantly using that wealth that they're creating to build positive relationships with other people within that area. And they can see the impact of the money. So when you spend something, if I spend 20% of my wealth on a certain thing, I'll see what that 20% of my wealth is doing. I'll see, oh well, it's actually having a really positive effect because those people who are using that money to go and do something else, which is really good. Or I can see that it's actually trashing the local woodland because I was paying that carpenter to go and cut down all the woods, and I really like going to the woods with my dog, so actually maybe I don't want to do that. So you can include all what normally just get brushed aside as externalities. Oh yes, well, externalities are actually our life. It's what we, in communities, all those externalities are what actually make us live a good life, I think. We want it to help achieve certain things. We want it to help build community. We want it to support independent businesses. We want it to help preference them over big transnational corporations, because if they've got hold of their money and they can use it with each other, then it doesn't disappear up out of large management structures and go offshore and end up in an account in the Cayman Islands. When we talk to businesses, actually, they get it pretty intuitively. The Bank of England, of course, may decide this is a threat to the stability of sterling. At the moment, they're reserving their right to take an opinion on it. They've sent us all their rules and regulations, and what we've done is we've got a team of lawyers who've given loads of work pro bono and said, okay, we'll work on this and we'll make it as watertight as you possibly can. In the end, what the Bank of England decide to do, we don't know.
You see a kind of widespread proliferation of alternatives. It's normally during periods of capitalist crisis. So the Great Depression, you had the kind of rise of a lot of scrip currencies, particularly in North America, and experiments in Europe as well, quite a lot. And most of those got extinguished through, basically being made illegal by the authority of the kind of central banks and the political forces deciding that they didn't want those experiments to carry on.
This monopoly state bank currency that we have is very good at some things. It's very easy to trade internationally with it. It helps big businesses, it cuts down their transaction costs, but it's not so good for independent businesses and it's not so good for localities.
So if we have a money system where the rules value community and connection between people within communities, over time you build up a better and more wealthy basis for a diverse local economy.
A bank run can take three forms. Customers can withdraw their money in cash. However, this will not reduce the digital money supply, it will merely transfer ownership. Or they can shift their money from the large institutions to smaller, more ethical banks, such as credit unions, mutual banks, or independent building societies.
Our next guest has a New Year's resolution, though. She says we'll create a better financial system. And it's this: move your money out of the nation's big banks and into your local community bank.
Shifting commercial bank money to these institutions will reduce the monopolistic grip of the big five banks.
于是克里斯汀宣告，11月5日将为转换银行日。银行用户誓言在当天关闭他们的银行户头，并将存款存入信用合作社。
The third type of bank run is the international bank run. According to at least one US senator, this is what caused the September 2008 meltdown.
Look, I was there when the Secretary and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve came those days and talked with members of Congress about what was going on. It was about September 15th. Here's the facts, and we don't even talk about these things. On Thursday at about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Federal Reserve noticed a tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion was being drawn out in a matter of an hour or two. The Treasury opened up its window to help. They pumped $105 billion in the system and quickly realized that they could not stem the tide. We were having an electronic run on the banks. They decided to close the operation, close down the money accounts, and announce a guarantee of $250,000 per account so there wouldn't be further panic out there. And that's what actually happened. If they had not done that, their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours the world economy would have collapsed.
When money is withdrawn internationally from one currency to another, the reserve currency shifts from the national bank of one country to the reserve account of the foreign bank. Foreign banks have relationships with local banks that allow them to hold foreign reserve currencies whilst not being a part of the central bank scheme at the local central bank. For example, when £1,000 is transferred into euros, a UK bank will agree an exchange rate with a euro area bank, perhaps 1.15 euros to the pound. The UK bank will then transfer £1,000 of the Central Reserve currency to the UK partner bank of the European Bank, whilst the European Bank will transfer 1,150 euros of reserve currency to the European partner bank of the UK Bank.
What happens when currencies and the exchange rate system is no longer managed? What are some of the first consequences? Devaluations, speculation, imbalances, where some countries would accrue more and more and more. What? What would they accrue? Other currencies. Other currencies.
The reserve currency needs to be spent in the country of origin, or exchanged into other currencies. Most foreign banks do not have deposit-taking accounts outside of their national borders, and as such, the foreign reserves they hold do not come back to them in the form of deposits. When a country accumulates trade imbalances, it either accumulates foreign reserve currencies, in the case of surplus, or spends its own reserves, in the case of negative trade balances.
Balance of trade is basically the difference between what you're selling abroad and what you're buying from abroad. Now, the feature on the UK is that for a very long period of time it's had a deficit on something called the visible balance of trade, which is trade in things, well, things that you can see. So that is goods that you'd recognise, stuff you can put in containers, it's cars, computers, things that you'd see in a shop. That's been in substantial deficit for, I think it opened up it did open up in the early 1980s. And essentially it hasn't gone away since, and if anything has got wider and wider.
Foreign exchange reserves cannot be directly used for domestic spending. The money can only be spent abroad or on imports. A country with a large balance of trade deficit relies on its creditors to spend the imbalances accrued in its own market.
I mean, there have been proposals in the past to try and create a mechanism for those imbalances to match up. So Keynes, for instance, John Maynard Keynes, at the end of the Second World War, his original proposal for what became Bretton Woods and the set of institutions set up there, like the IMF and the World Bank, was that there would be a kind of international clearing union. This is particularly relating to the trade side rather than the sort of the financial side directly. But the principle was that, you know, once trade balances had opened up, everybody would bank through an international clearing bank, and that would kind of force everyone to eventually reconcile the imbalances that appeared in the real economy.
But no such mechanism exists. The accumulated net trade imbalance for the UK is around £800 billion.
In essence, what has happened is that over many years, some countries have had big trade surpluses and others big trade deficits. The countries with trade deficits have been spending more than they've been earning, so they've had to borrow from abroad. And they've been doing this year after year. Countries like that are the United States, ourselves, and some other countries in Europe. That cannot go on. And there are two ways in which this can come to an end. Either, and we're seeing this in some other countries in Europe, if they can't find new ways to become competitive, then their ability to repay the debts is called into question. Another way of doing it, which we followed, is that we've got a credible plan to repay our debts, and the value of sterling has fallen by 25% to make our exports more competitive and attractive to overseas buyers, and it to be more attractive for British consumers to buy from British producers rather than overseas producers. That is what we have done to put in place a framework to rebalance our economy, and I'm sure that's the right way to do it.
Currency war, also known as competitive devaluation, is a condition where countries compete against each other to achieve a relatively low exchange rate for their currency. As the price to buy a particular currency falls, so too does the real price of exports from that country. Domestic industry receives a boost in demand, both at home and abroad.
It's made British exports appear rather cheaper, so they've kind of recovered a little bit, but because the rest of the world is now looking really quite ropey, they've started to fall back down again. So what we're looking at is something that almost a kind of anarchy, and in a way, the increasing anarchy. This is what's happened over the last few years, where the Brazilian finance minister has been most vocal about this, talking about currency wars, talking about the desire of national governments when confronted by a major recession. They think if we could export more, we could dig ourselves out of this recession. If we want to export more, we depreciate our currency. That makes our goods cheaper, everyone else buys them, we'll all be better off. Now, the issue here is that if you depreciate, it's like everybody else appreciates against you. Their stuff becomes more expensive, so they're not too happy about that. They also want to depreciate. And this is where you can see a competitive round of devaluations breaking out.
To decrease the value of its national currency, a national central bank sells reserve currency into the market. It creates this currency out of nothing by typing numbers into a computer. During the long phase of commodity money, the exchange rate would depend on the amount of gold, silver, or copper contained in the coins of each country. Similarly, after the advent of paper money and the gold standard, the exchange rate depended on the amount of gold a government promised to pay the holder of the banknotes. These amounts did not vary greatly in the short term, and as such, exchange rates between currencies were relatively stable. After the Second World War, currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was backed by gold. This system came to an end in 1971.
So, we have a modern financial system where money is now chaotically organized. There is no exchange rate because there's no gold standard system to sustain. So we don't need it. In fact, we believe the market will resolve all of the problems of exchange. Whether your currency should be worth more than mine is a reflection of your economy relative to mine. And if that changes, the currency and the exchange rate can change. And if we need that to happen, it'll happen magically by the efficiency of market and profit seeking, and you guys know the rest, I think.
A currency's value in relation to another currency is determined by the market. If more people want to buy a currency than sell it, its value increases. If more people want to sell, its value decreases. The value is set by individual banks. As they buy and sell currencies, they will adjust the exchange rate.
In the last study I read in 2007, each day on currency markets, $3.2 trillion are traded each day. Who knows what the global GDP is? 50. Again, Brucey, higher. 60, that's closer. The point is, think about that exchange happening every single day. There's about 260 business days a year. It takes a few weeks to manage.